every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. Water is elemental. It is life, a universal solvent, a biological necessity, the substance that makes up more than half of our own bodies. We are drawn to it, born from it. We trust it implicitly. We turn on a tap, fill a glass and drink, engaging in an act of faith so common, so automatic, that we rarely even recognize it as such. It is a covenant between a people and their government, an unspoken promise that the most basic element of our survival will be kept safe. This is the story of what happens when that covenant is not just broken, but corroded from the inside out, when the water that is meant to sustain life becomes a carrier of irreversible harm. This is the story of Flint, Michigan. It begins not with a single act of malice, but with a slow, grinding decay. It's a story that unfolds in spreadsheets and budget meetings, in bureaucratic emails, and dismissive press conferences. The crime scene is not a dark alleyway, but an entire city of nearly 100,000 people. The weapon is not a gun or a knife, but the public water system itself. And the victims are not discovered by a lone detective, but by mothers watching their children break out in rashes, by scientists running tests in university labs, and by doctors noticing a terrifying trend in the blood work of their smallest, most vulnerable patients. The story of Flint is often framed as a tragic accident, an environmental catastrophe born of incompetence. But to view it that way is to miss the terrifying deliberateness at its core. It was a crisis born of choices, made by people in positions of power, who were warned repeatedly of the consequences, and chose to ignore them. They chose to ignore the science. They chose to ignore the federal regulations. And most damningly, they chose to ignore the voices of the people they were sworn to serve. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a public trust betrayal. We will trace the path of the poison, not just through the city's aging pipes, but through the very corridors of power, to understand how a city in the heart of America was sacrificed for the sake of saving a few dollars a day. To understand the water crisis, one must first understand Flint. Long before its name became synonymous with lead poisoning, it was Vehicle City, the birthplace of General Motors, a titan of the American auto industry. For much of the 20th century, Flint was a symbol of American prosperity. This was the city of Buick City and Chevy in the whole, sprawling factory complexes that were cities unto themselves. It was the epicenter of the United Auto Workers, the site of the pivotal sit-down strikes of the 1930s that cemented the power of organized labor in America. A job on the line at GM was a ticket to the middle class. It meant a mortgage, a car, a pension, and the promise that your children could do even better. The city hummed with the engine of progress, its identity inextricably linked to the chrome and steel that rolled off its assembly lines. At its peak in the 1960s, GM employed nearly 80,000 people in and around Flint. But the forces of deindustrialization and globalization that reshaped the American landscape hit Flint with the force of a wrecking ball. Starting in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 80s and 90s, the jobs began to vanish. The 1973 oil crisis sparked a demand for smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, a market dominated by foreign competitors. GM struggled to adapt. The jobs moved, first to other states, then overseas. The 1989 documentary, Roger and Me, chronicled this economic collapse for a national audience, painting a grim portrait of a city hollowed out its central purpose erased as GM shed over 30,000 local jobs. The decline continued relentlessly. By 2010, fewer than 8,000 GM jobs remained. The human and economic toll was catastrophic. As the jobs left, so did the people. The city's population, once a bustling metropolis of nearly 200,000, was cut in half. Those who could afford to leave, often white middle-class families, fled to the suburbs, contributing to a phenomenon of white flight that further segregated the city and decimated its tax base. What remained was a city struggling to survive. Block after block of abandoned homes stood as silent monuments to a bygone era. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. Poverty rates soared. And by 2011, Flint was ranked by the FBI as one of the most violent cities in America. The city government, starved of revenue, teetered on the brink of insolvency, caught in a death spiral of shrinking services and a growing deficit. It was against this backdrop of systemic failure that the state of Michigan intervened. In 2011, Governor Rick Snyder, a Republican businessman who had run on a platform of bringing financial acumen to government, declared that Flint was in a state of financial emergency. He utilized a controversial law, Public Act 4, later replaced by Public Act 436, known as the Emergency Manager Law. This law granted the governor the power to appoint a single individual, an emergency manager, to take complete control of a financially distressed city or school district. This was not a partnership. It was a takeover. The emergency manager had sweeping, almost dictatorial powers. They could override the decisions of the democratically elected mayor and city council. They could renegotiate or dissolve union contracts, sell off city assets, and make unilateral decisions about municipal services. Proponents argued it was a necessary, if bitter, medicine to pull cities back from the financial abyss. Critics, however, saw it as a profound act of disenfranchisement. They pointed out that the law was almost exclusively applied to majority black cities like Flint, Benton Harbor, and Detroit, effectively silencing the votes of their residents and replacing local democracy with an unaccountable, state-appointed technocrat. The core mandate of the emergency manager was not public welfare, community development, or long-term investment. It was pure, unadulterated austerity. It was to cut costs, balance the books, and do it quickly. This singular focus on the bottom line, this elevation of fiscal metrics above all else, would become the fertile ground in which the seeds of the water crisis were sown. For 50 years, the city of Flint had purchased its treated drinking water from the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, or DWSD. The water was sourced from Lake Huron, one of the largest bodies of fresh water on the planet, and was delivered through a well-maintained and reliable system. It was clean, it was safe, and for half a century it was not a source of concern for Flint residents. But it was also expensive. As Flint's financial crisis deepened, the rising cost of this water became a prominent and painful line item on the city's strained budget. Local leaders in Genesee County, looking for a long-term solution that would provide both cost savings and regional autonomy, began developing a new pipeline project. The Carignan-D Water Authority, or KWA, this new pipeline would also draw water from Lake Huron, but would be managed by a consortium of local governments, including Flint. The logic was that owning a stake in the infrastructure would be cheaper in the long run than continuing to be a customer of Detroit. In 2013, Flint's state-appointed emergency manager, Ed Kurtz, with the approval of the state treasurer, made the decision official. Flint would join the KWA. This decision set in motion a critical chain of events. The city of Flint gave DWSD a 1-year notice that it would be terminating its long-term water contract. The KWA pipeline, however, was a massive construction project that would not be completed for at least 2 or 3 years. This created an interim problem. Where would Flint get its water in the meantime? The DWSD, facing the loss of a major customer, made several increasingly desperate offers to keep supplying Flint with water at a significantly reduced rate until the KWA pipeline was operational. But Flint's new emergency manager, Darnell Early, rejected the offers. He and other state officials were committed to the switch, driven by internal projections that showed using a local water source in the interim would save the city an estimated $5 million over 2 years. The chosen local source was the Flint River. The Flint River had a long and troubled history. For over a century, it had served as an unofficial dumping ground for the city's industrial and municipal waste, tanneries, meat packing plants, lumber mills, and of course, the auto factories had all discharged their effluent, both treated and untreated, into its waters. While the Clean Water Act and subsequent cleanup efforts had improved its quality over the decades, it was still known within the environmental engineering community to be a challenging water source, unpredictable, high in organic matter, and, most importantly, highly corrosive. A 2011 engineering report commissioned by the city had explicitly warned that using the Flint River would require significant upgrades to the city's water treatment plant and a robust chemical treatment plan to make it safe for consumption. Despite these warnings, the plan moved forward, driven by the relentless logic of austerity. The Flint water treatment plant, which had been dormant for decades as a primary water source, was hastily brought back online. Emails would later show that even officials at the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality expressed private concerns about the plant's readiness and the city's ability to manage such a difficult water source. But the financial imperative, championed by the emergency manager and endorsed by the state treasury, overruled all other considerations. On April 25, 2014, city and state officials gathered on the banks of the Flint River for a celebratory press event. Mayor Dane Walling pushed a button, and a valve was turned. Darnell Early and other officials raised glasses of the newly treated river water in a toast to the city's fiscal prudence and self-sufficiency. The flow of clean, stable water from Lake Huron was cut off, and the corrosive water of the Flint River began to flow into the city's aging network of pipes. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. The problems appeared almost immediately. Within days of the switch, residents began to complain. The water flowing from their taps was discolored, ranging from a pale yellow to a murky, viscous brown. It had a foul, metallic smell and an unpleasant taste. People reported developing itchy skin rashes, painful lesions, and losing clumps of their hair after bathing or showering. A mother named Melissa Mays watched as her sons broke out in mysterious ailments after contact with the water. She, like many others, began calling City Hall, trying to get answers. The official response was dismissive and patronizing. City officials assured them the water was safe, that the discoloration was due to a temporary increase in iron from the old cast-iron water mains being flushed out. They told residents to run their taps until the water cleared, a measure that only increased their already high water bills for a product they were now afraid to use, drink, or even touch. The complaints were not just anecdotal. In the summer of 2014, the city was forced to issue multiple boil water advisories after tests, revealed the presence of E. coli bacteria, an indicator of fecal contamination. The city responded by flushing the system and increasing the amount of chlorine disinfectant in the water. This, however, created an unintended and dangerous consequence. The high levels of chlorine reacted with the abundant organic matter in the river water to create a byproduct called total trihalomethanes, or TTHMs. TTHMs are regulated by the EPA because long-term exposure is linked to an increased risk of liver, kidney, and central nervous system problems, as well as bladder and colon cancer. By the end of 2014, the city of Flint was in official violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act for having dangerously elevated levels of TTHMs. They were poisoning the city in an attempt to disinfect the water. One of the most telling and damning early warnings came not from a resident, but from the city's former economic engine, General Motors. In October 2014, just 6 months after the switch, the GM engine plant in Flint announced it was stopping its use of the municipal water. The high chloride content of the Flint River water, a key component of its corrosivity, was visibly rusting their newly machined engine parts. The irony was staggering and grotesque. The water, deemed too corrosive for auto parts, was still being piped into the homes, schools, and bodies of the city's residents. General Motors was quietly permitted to strike a deal to disconnect from the Flint water system and tap into a different water line to once again receive the clean water from Lake Huron. It was a luxury not afforded to the people who lived and worked in the city that GM built. Their pleas were ignored, but the threat to corporate property was met with swift and decisive action. As the months wore on, the residents grew more desperate and more organized. They began showing up at city council meetings with jugs and bottles of their discolored, foul-smelling water, demanding answers and action from a local government that had been rendered powerless by the emergency manager. One of those residents was a mother of 4 named Leanne Walters. Walters was a determined stay-at-home mom who refused to accept the city's empty assurances. Her family was experiencing a host of unexplained health problems. Her own eyelashes were falling out. One of her twin boys had stopped growing properly. The whole family had rashes. After the city tested her water and found an alarmingly high lead level of 397 parts per billion, they sent a technician who told her the problem was likely her home's internal plumbing. Walters refused to believe it. She knew the problem was bigger than her house. She began her own obsessive research, spending hours a day on the internet, reading engineering manuals and EPA regulations, transforming herself into a citizen scientist, determined to uncover the truth. Her fight would eventually bring the crisis to the attention of the world. The true poison in Flint's water was invisible. It wasn't the brown color, the E. coli, or the TTHMs. It was lead, a potent neurotoxin with devastating and permanent effects, particularly on the developing brains and nervous systems of children. Even low levels of lead exposure can lead to a lower IQ, attention disorders, learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and lifelong health issues. Higher levels can damage organs and, in extreme cases, cause comas or death. There is no safe level of lead in the human body. The lead wasn't coming from the Flint River itself. It was coming from the city's infrastructure. Like many older American cities, Flint had a vast network of lead service lines, the smaller pipes that connect individual homes to the main water distribution lines under the street. For 50 years, the treated water from Detroit's system had contained an anti-corrosive agent, specifically orthophosphate, This food-grade chemical is added to water to form a protective mineral coating on the inside of the pipes, a sort of artificial plaque that acts as a barrier, preventing the lead in the pipes from leaching into the water passing through them. This is a standard federally mandated practice for any water system with lead pipes and is the cornerstone of the EPA's lead and copper rule. When the city of Flint, under the direction of the emergency manager, switched to the highly corrosive Flint River water, officials at the Flint water treatment plant made a catastrophic and, as prosecutors would later allege, criminal decision. They did not add any corrosion control treatment. This single omission was the central cause of the crisis. Without the protective orthophosphate, the chlorhydric river water acted like a chemical scouring pad. It ate away at the inside of the lead pipes and service lines, stripping away the protective mineral scale that had been built up over decades and dissolving the raw lead directly into the water supply. This poison was then delivered to every home, school, and business in the city every time someone turned on the tap. This was not simply an oversight or a mistake born of ignorance. It was a direct and knowing violation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency's lead and copper rule. This rule explicitly requires water systems of Flint's size to maintain a corrosion control program. Internal emails and testimony would later reveal a shocking story of deception and regulatory malpractice by the very state agency tasked with enforcing these rules, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, or MDEQ. Key MDEQ officials, including Stephen Bush and Michael Prisby, allegedly told the city of Flint that it did not need to implement corrosion control immediately. They claimed incorrectly that the city could wait for 2 6-month monitoring periods to pass before deciding if such treatment was necessary. This interpretation of the rule was, according to every credible expert and the EPA itself, patently false. The rule requires corrosion control to be in place from the outset for a system using a new water source known to be corrosive. Then, as resident complaints mounted and testing began, a concerted effort to manipulate the data appears to have begun. Leaked MDEQ emails showed officials instructing Flint water employees on how to collect water samples in ways specifically designed to minimize the chances of finding high lead levels. The lead and copper rule requires testing water from first draw samples at high-risk homes, that is, water that has been sitting stagnant in the lead service lines for at least 6 hours. MDEQ officials, however, instructed sample collectors to pre-flush the taps for several minutes the night before and again in the morning before collecting the sample. This clears out the water with the highest lead concentration. They also provided collectors with narrow-mouthed bottles, which fill slowly and can miss the initial burst of lead-heavy water. When one of these flawed tests still came back with a dangerously high reading, one MDEQ official suggested in an email, "I would recommend we drop this one." By systematically gaming the sample collection process and discarding high results, the MDEQ was able to produce official reports that fraudulently claimed Flint's water was in compliance with federal law, even as the poison continued to flow unchecked. The first official alarm from inside the government came not from the state, but from a lone regulator at the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. In February 2015, Miguel del Toro, a regulations manager for the EPA's Midwest region and an expert on the lead and copper rule, received a call from Leanne Walters. Walters, the activist mother, explained her family's health problems. the city's dismissive response, and her own research into corrosion control, Del Toro was immediately concerned. He walked her through the proper way to test her water, a method designed to find the highest possible concentration of lead. The results were staggering. One sample came back at 13,200 parts per billion. To put that in perspective, the EPA's action level, the point at which remediation is required, is 15 parts per billion. The level at which the EPA classifies water as hazardous waste is 5,000 parts per billion. The water flowing from the tap in Leanne Walters' home was literally toxic waste. Del Toro knew he was looking at a citywide catastrophe. In June 2015, he wrote a scathing internal memo titled High Lead Levels in Flint, Michigan, an interim report. In it, he detailed the city's critical failure to use corrosion control, the potentially imminent and substantial endangerment to public health, and the state's fatally flawed testing protocols that were leading to a false sense of security. He sounded the clearest possible alarm. But his memo was not made public. Instead, his superiors at the EPA, in coordination with officials from the MDEQ, moved to suppress it. MDEQ spokesperson Brad Werfel publicly dismissed Del Toro's findings as the work of a rogue employee. The EPA's Region 5 administrator, Susan Hedman, rather than acting on the warning, apologized to the MDEQ for the memo's release and worked internally to discredit her own expert. The system designed to protect the public was now actively engaged in protecting itself. But Leanne Walters had also reached out to another expert, a professor from Virginia Tech named Mark Edwards. Edwards was a nationally recognized expert on water quality and corrosion, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient known for his work uncovering a similar lead crisis in Washington, D.C. a decade earlier. Intrigued and disturbed by Walter's story and the official stonewalling she described, Edwards and his team of student researchers secured a grant and traveled to Flint. They launched their own independent, citizen-led water testing project. They assembled and distributed nearly 300 testing kits to residents throughout the city, instructing them on the proper, scientifically rigorous collection methods that Del Toro had recommended and that the MDEQ had deliberately avoided. The results, released in September 2015, were definitive and horrifying. The Virginia Tech study confirmed that Flint had a citywide lead contamination problem of epic proportions. Their findings showed that lead levels were dangerously high across the city, and that in some homes they were astronomical. The state of Michigan, however, continued to deny the problem. Officials publicly attacked Mark Edwards, with MDEQ spokesperson Brad Werfel famously dismissing the Virginia Tech team as a bunch of lead-leaching academics who were needlessly scaring people for their own gain. The state's official position remained unchanged. The water was safe. The final, undeniable proof, the evidence that would finally break through the wall of denial, would come from a local pediatrician, Dr. Mona Hanatisha. An old friend, a water expert, had shared Mark Edwards' study with her, and a chill went down her spine. As the director of the pediatric residency program at Flint's Hurley Medical Center, she knew better than anyone the profound and irreversible damage that lead can do to a child's developing brain. If what Mark Edwards was saying was true, it meant a generation of Flint's children was being systematically and permanently harmed. She realized she was sitting on the data that could prove it. Hospitals and public health departments routinely conduct blood tests on young children to screen for lead exposure. Dr. Hanatisha and her team of researchers began a frantic, painstaking process of digging through thousands of electronic medical records, comparing the blood lead levels in Flint children before the water switch in April 2014 to the levels after the switch. The results of her study were heartbreakingly clear and statistically irrefutable. After the switch to the Flint River, the percentage of children in Flint with elevated blood lead levels had doubled, from 2.1% to 4.0%. In certain high-risk neighborhoods with older infrastructure, it had tripled to over 6%. The poison wasn't just in the water, it was in the bodies of the children. Armed with this incontrovertible data, Dr. Hannah Tisha held a press conference on September 24, 2015. She laid out her findings, her voice shaking with a mixture of scientific certainty and moral outrage, and called for an immediate end to the use of the Flint River for drinking water. The state's reaction was swift and hostile. Officials tried to discredit her, just as they had Del Toro and Edwards. A spokesperson for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, or MDHHS, called her findings unfortunate and publicly claimed that the state's own data did not match hers. They publicly accused her of causing near hysteria and of releasing inaccurate information, an attempt to paint a concerned doctor as an irresponsible fearmonger. For a few agonizing days, it was the word of a single doctor against the entire machinery of the state government. But Dr. Hannah Tisha refused to back down. She knew her science was sound, and she had shared her methodology with the state, daring them to re-examine their own numbers. Under mounting pressure from the media, public health experts, and the public, the state finally did, and in a stunning reversal, they were forced to admit that she was right. Their own previously unanalyzed data confirmed her findings exactly. The cover-up had crumbled. On October 1, 2015, Governor Rick Snyder held a press conference and admitted there was a problem with lead in Flint's water. A few days later, he announced a plan to provide filters and switch the city back to the Detroit water system. On October 16, 2015, nearly 18 months after the fateful switch, the valve was turned again, and clean water from Lake Huron began to flow back into Flint. But the damage was already done. The corrosive river water had permanently scarred the city's infrastructure. The protective coating inside the pipes was gone, and lead continued to leach into the water, a problem that would persist for years, necessitating massive pipe replacement programs and the continued use of bottled water. And there was another, even deadlier consequence that was only beginning to come to light. During the same period that Flint was using the river water, Genesee County experienced a massive outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, a severe, atypical form of pneumonia caused by Legionella bacteria. The outbreak sickened at least 90 people and killed at least 12. Scientists would later link the outbreak directly to the water switch. The change in water chemistry, specifically the lack of corrosion control, and the subsequent high levels of chlorine which killed off competing microbes, created the perfect conditions for the Legionella bacteria to thrive in the city's sprawling water system. Worse still, internal state documents would later reveal that officials at the MDHHS had known about the spike in Legionnaire's cases and its likely link to the water change as early as January 2015, but had deliberately concealed this information from the public and even from the governor's office for over a year. In January 2016, as the full scale of the disaster became public knowledge, Governor Snyder declared a state of emergency for Flint. President Barack Obama followed with a federal emergency declaration. The National Guard arrived to distribute bottled water and filters. The national media descended on the city. Flint was now the center of a national scandal, and with the public outcry came the calls for accountability. The question on everyone's mind was no longer what had happened, but who was responsible. Was this just a story of incompetence, or was it a crime? Michigan's then Attorney General, Bill Schuette, a Republican with ambitions to run for governor, launched a sweeping criminal investigation. He appointed a special prosecutor, Todd Flood, and assembled a team of investigators who began poring over tens of millions of documents and interviewing hundreds of witnesses. In 2016 and 2017, the charges began to roll in. In total, 15 state and local officials were criminally charged for their roles in the crisis. The charges ranged from willful neglect of duty and conspiracy to misconduct in office and, most seriously, involuntary manslaughter. Among the accused were the MDEQ officials, Stephen Bush and Michael Prisby, who allegedly misled the EPA and manipulated water testing data. There was Leanne Schechter-Smith, the former chief of the state's Office of Drinking Water. There were the emergency managers, Darnell Early and Jerry Ambrose, who oversaw the switch. And at the highest level, there was Nick Leone, the director of the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and Dr. Eden Wells, the state's chief medical executive. Both Leone and Wells were charged with involuntary manslaughter, with prosecutors alleging their deliberate failure to warn the public about the deadly Legionnaire's disease outbreak resulted in at least one preventable death. The investigation appeared to be a textbook example of a justice system working to hold power accountable. It was methodical, aggressive, and aimed at the very top of the state government. For the residents of Flint, it seemed that justice, while delayed, might finally be within reach. But the legal path forward would prove to be as corroded and treacherous as the city's old pipes. In 2018, Michigan held a gubernatorial election. Bill Schuette, the Republican Attorney General who had launched the prosecutions, lost his bid for governor to Democrat Gretchen Whitmer. The new Attorney General was Dana Nessel, a Democrat. In a highly unusual move, Nessel's office, in June 2019, dismissed all pending criminal charges against all 8 remaining defendants, including the manslaughter charges against Nick Leone and Eden Wells. The cases that had been painstakingly built over 3 years were wiped from the slate. The new prosecution team, led by Solicitor General Fadwa Hammoud, argued that the original investigation under Schuette had been fundamentally flawed. They claimed the previous team had overlooked crucial evidence hidden on state-owned servers and had entered into overly lenient plea deals with some lower-level defendants that may have shielded higher-ranking officials. They promised a new, more thorough investigation that would start from scratch. This new investigation utilized a controversial and rarely used legal tool in Michigan, a one-man grand jury. Instead of presenting evidence to a panel of citizens, the prosecution presented it in secret to a single judge, who then decided whether to issue indictments. In January 2021, the new charges were announced. 9 former officials were indicted, including some who had been charged before. This time, the net reached all the way to the top. Former Governor Rick Snyder was charged with 2 misdemeanor counts of willful neglect of duty. Nick Leone was once again charged with involuntary manslaughter, as were Darnell Early, Jerry Ambrose, and several others. The residents of Flint felt a renewed, if cautious, sense of hope. The former governor himself was now facing a criminal trial. But this hope would be short-lived. The defense attorneys for the indicted officials immediately challenged the legality of the one-man grand jury process. They argued that while a one-man grand jury has the power to investigate and issue subpoenas, it does not have the constitutional power to issue indictments itself. That power, they argued, belongs to a traditional grand jury or a prosecutor, following a public preliminary examination where evidence is presented and can be challenged. The case worked its way through the courts, and in June 2022, the Michigan Supreme Court delivered a devastating blow to the prosecution. In a unanimous decision, the court agreed with the defense. The one-man grand jury had no authority to issue indictments. The entire process was legally invalid from its inception. The ruling was a procedural bombshell. It had nothing to do with the guilt or innocence of the accused, the mountains of evidence, or the facts of the case. It was based entirely on legal process. Because the indictments were deemed void from the start, all charges stemming from them had to be dismissed. One by one, the cases collapsed. In October 2022, a lower court judge formally dismissed the charges against Leon Wells and 5 others. Finally, in late 2023, the last remaining charges, the misdemeanors against former Governor Rick Snyder, were also dismissed after the Supreme Court declined to hear the prosecution's final appeal. And with that, it was over. After years of investigations, millions of taxpayer dollars spent, and promises of accountability from 2 different attorneys general, not a single person would be held criminally responsible for the Flint water crisis, not for the lead poisoning of thousands of children, not for the deaths of at least 12 people from Legionnaire's disease, not for the lies, the data manipulation, or the cover-up. The complex web of legal proceedings had ended in a total and catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system. The only tangible form of restitution would come from the civil courts. In 2021, a federal judge approved a massive $626 million settlement, funded mostly by the state of Michigan, to compensate the residents of Flint. The majority of the money was earmarked for the children who were exposed to the lead-poisoned water. It was a staggering sum, but for many, it was a hollow victory. Money that could help pay for medical care and support services, but could never undo the damage or replace the demand for genuine justice. In the end, the story of the Flint water crisis is a chronicle of intersecting failures. It was a failure of infrastructure, the result of decades of disinvestment in a city left behind by the American economy. It was a failure of science, a willful disregard for the basic chemistry of water and the known dangers of lead. It was a failure of government at every conceivable level. The city, stripped of its democratic power, was helpless. The state, driven by an ideology of austerity, prioritized cost-cutting over human life, and the federal government, the ultimate backstop, was too slow and too deferential to act on the clear warnings from its own expert. But to dissect the anatomy of this crime is to see that it was, most profoundly, a failure of public trust. The betrayal was not a single event, but a cascade of them. It was the decision to treat the people of a poor, majority-black city as disposable, their complaints as background noise. It was the choice to manipulate data, to silence whistleblowers, and to lie directly to the faces of frightened parents holding jugs of brown water. It was the cold, bureaucratic calculation that the health of children was an acceptable risk in the service of balancing a budget. This crime wasn't committed with a weapon you can hold, but with a pen, a spreadsheet, and the quiet, corrosive power of indifference. The lead may one day be gone from Flint's pipes, replaced by new copper lines that carry safe water, But the poison of this betrayal lingers. It settled in the bones of a generation of children, and eroded the foundational faith that a government, at its most basic level, will protect its people from harm. It demonstrated that in a system where power is insulated and accountability is diffuse, it is possible to poison an entire city and have no one legally to blame. The true corrosion in Flint was not merely of metal, but of the sacred covenant between the governed and those who govern. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.